I'm your usual host, Dr. Jibs, with Jibs in the studio with me. Jibs, say hello to our listeners.
Hi, guys.
And with us in the studio today is a special guest, a very special guest. She's Abimbola Adebakin, who is the CEO of OutRRAage Health Africa. And she's also the head of a franchise that hosts Rage rooms across the world globally. In Nigeria, this Rage room is situated in Ikate, Lekki, and it's called OutRRAage. You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Abimbola Adebakin. It's lovely to have you on the show today.
I'm happy to be here.
Okay. So today we'll be discussing the link between childhood trauma and addiction. And we're going to have a very interesting perspective today. But before I proceed, I just want to share a few vignettes with you. First, I'll be discussing Emma, who's a 7-year-old girl who's grown up in an environment of severe neglect. Her parents are absent, providing minimal care and attention. As a result, Emma experiences emotional neglect, malnutrition, and lacks essential nurturing. She struggles with attachment issues, difficulty regulating emotions, and delays in social and cognitive development. Our second case today is Jake, who is a 10-year-old boy, frequently witnessing his parents engaging in violent confrontations. The constant exposure to domestic violence traumatizes him, leading to heightened anxiety, hypervigilance, and difficulty concentrating in school. Jake's trauma impacts his overall sense of safety and stability. Our third and final vignette for today will be Tayo, who is a 15-year-old girl who experiences the sudden loss of her mother in a public bus accident. She had to move in with her maternal uncle, whose wife pulls her out of school, engages her in excessive household chores, and sends her to hawk plantain during school hours. Tayo sinks further into deep grief, has trouble processing her emotions, struggles to find purpose, and manage her relationships. So these are 3 case scenarios of childhood trauma. Today we'll be talking about childhood trauma and adverse childhood experiences. How adverse childhood experiences can be traumatic for children, and then how this can then lead to unhealthy coping habits such as addiction in later life. Now, adverse childhood experiences have been categorized across several domains. For most of us, we're very familiar with abuse, be it emotional abuse, physical, sexual. But I must tell you today that it also involves neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, violence in the home, be it intimate partner violence or domestic violence, substance abuse within the home by another family member, presence of mental illness in the home existing in another family member, presence of separation or divorce, and even incarceration of a family member. So typically when a person comes in with repressed emotions, anger outbursts, unexplained expressions of trauma, we run them through ACE assessments, which is adverse childhood experience assessments. And we typically will ask questions such as this. We'll ask, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or threaten you in a way that made you think that you might be physically hurt? That signifies emotional abuse. We can also ask if a parent or an adult in the household pushed, grabbed, slapped, or threw something at the child while they were growing up, which left marks or left them injured. We also ask questions around touching from as little as 5 years, if there's any touching or fondling the body parts in an inappropriate way, or engagement in oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse which was inappropriate for a child of that age. We would also ask questions around that. In terms of emotional neglect, we would bother on feelings that no one in the family loved him or her, or thought that they were not important or special to anyone else in the family, or if the child did not feel close or supported by any other member of the family, that can be seen or felt as emotional neglect. In terms of physical neglect, some children experience not having enough to eat, no one paying attention to if they wear dirty clothes or clean clothes, or if their clothes are torn or well to put together. There's no one to protect the child. The parents were too drunk or too involved or too over involved in something else, to the extent that they didn't even care about how the child looked, if the child's weight was appropriate, if the child was well fed, if the child was healthy enough. All these things can be termed together under the bracket of physical neglect. Also, if a child grows up in a family or in a household where the mother or stepmother was often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, kicked or beaten or hit by her partner or her spouse, or if the spouse even went ahead to threaten with violent objects such as knives or guns, these are also very traumatic for a child witnessing this event. Even if the child did not experience it directly, just watching the mother experience such an event is very traumatic. Also, if the child has grown up in a household where there's a problematic drinker or an alcoholic or someone that abuses street drugs in the presence of the child, so the child grows up seeing someone get drunk heavily, seeing someone overdose on drugs, that is also mentally and psychologically traumatic for the child. In households where there's a family member growing up with undiagnosed, untreated, or poorly managed mental illness, or suicide attempts, in the presence of the child, or the child is aware that there's been a suicide attempt, this can also have long-standing psychological effects. And the last two parameters on our ACE will be if the child has been separated. So if the parents have been separated and the child has had to make a decision to live with one parent or the other, and if there's some form of discord between both parents where they're fighting or arguing over who should take custody of the child, such issues or such situations are traumatic. And lastly, if there's ever been a family member who has gone to prison or been in and out of jail several times, this is also very traumatic for children. So in a nutshell, adverse childhood experiences, which range from emotional, physical and sexual abuse to emotional and physical neglect, to mother being treated violently in the house, or a household member heavily using alcohol or any other substance, or the presence of undiagnosed, untreated or poorly managed mental illness, or parental separation and divorce in the presence of ongoing discord and incarcerated household members. These all come together to form adverse childhood experiences. So a traumatic event is one that threatens injury, death, or the physical integrity of self or others, and also causes horror, terror, or helplessness at the time that it occurs. Children grow up in environments where they see things, they're exposed to these things, but adults feel like the child is not seeing it, the child is not watching it. Children are like sponges. They're there, they might not talk, they might not say anything, but they're absorbing everything going on in their environment. They're soaking it all in, and in soaking up all these things, somehow they learn to cope in that environment. They learn to just survive with these issues. And I must add that the frequency in which these situations occur also play a big impact. Trauma can be one time and extremely grievous, and you never forget it, such as maybe an armed robber coming into the house, raiding the house. It can happen one time in a lifetime, but it can be remembered forever. The consequences can last a lifetime. It can be watching someone being killed, so someone being shot to death right in front of the individual. Such memories never ever leave the individual. They can linger forever, but in that situation the child might carry on, go back to school the next day, carry on like nothing happened. But the child might experience that and go back to school the next day like nothing happened. But over time, certain signs or symptoms start to show, certain signs of distress start to show, and in later life they can it can progress to unhealthy coping patterns, such as the one we're discussing today. So adverse events can be a one-time, grievous, life-changing, life-threatening event, or it can be in small doses, smaller intensity, but occurring frequently, like in domestic violence or in abuse, stuff like that happening frequently over the course of the child's life, but still having the same magnitude of effect. It's the same magnitude of effect as that one-time grievous event. So, in linking childhood trauma to addiction, we say there can be like a three-way relationship. So childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences can lead to addiction. Addiction can lead to childhood trauma, and then they can both occur by chance. When we say childhood trauma leading to addiction, it's like what I've just described now. A child growing up in a household where they're made to experience such adverse experiences or encounter such adverse experiences, and they grow up seeing assault on a regular basis, neglect on a regular basis, mental illness in a loved one. Sometimes it can even be life-threatening illness. It might not even be mental illness. It might be cancer. Growing up as a child in a household where a family member lives with cancer for a prolonged period of time, and the child has to be involved in the care of that individual, and they watch the individual deteriorate from one state to another, or some other chronic conditions. Such things can also be emotionally traumatic. Also, refugee situations, war experiences can be traumatic, school violence, and other issues or situations like I have described. So such traumatic experiences can lead to unhealthy coping habits, such as addiction in later life. Now, addiction in the household, like I said earlier, a family member, a parent, an extended family member drinking excessively, smoking excessively, engaging in drugs, exhibiting erratic behavior, unpredictable behavior. Children growing up within that environment, within that household, having to experience that day in, day out, can then lead to trauma in those children. They're seeing that addiction going on in a parent or a loved one every day can become traumatic for them as time progresses. And then both can occur by chance. A young child being exposed to adverse situations, having to hawk things on the road, having to be neglected, and then coming in contact with addictive substances at that point to numb the pain that they are feeling. So that can occur by chance. Now we're moving on to the psychological effects of trauma. But before I move on, I would open up the phone lines. The numbers to call are 0703 2277 338, 0703 2277 338, or 0909 555 1039, 0909 555 1039. I believe that we have a message from one of our regular listeners. Okay, it says, "Hello, Dr. Gibbs. I'm really excited on this topic, as it is a topic most of us usually shy away from, as we do not want to paint our parents as bad. In cases like this, how do we address our parents on the trauma they have caused us?" Okay, so we will go on. I'm sure that's where, when we go on a bit further in the show and we have Miss Abimbola coming on the conversation, she would help us talk a bit more about that. So now we'll be moving on to the psychological effects of trauma on children. So childhood trauma or adverse reactions can have psychological and biological effects. The effects can be psychological and biological. In terms of psychological effects, children who experience this, who've had this experience I've listed above, and even experiences such as frequent disconnect from their primary caregiver. I talked about this in one of our previous shows, where the pattern where we change house helps frequently, that from children from under 5, from 1 year to 5 years, when they form an attachment with a caregiver, be it a house help, be it an extended family member, and then every 3 months you're recycling house helps, every 6 months you're recycling house help. They've met that person, they formed a bond with the person, and then you detach that relationship. They meet someone else again, form the same bond, you detach the relationship. If that cycle continues like that, in several situations within that first 5 years of life, you find that that individual will struggle with attachments and relationships in later life. So it's important for us to understand it's something as simple as house help. For some parents, you feel I'm the parent, I'm always there. I'm the father, I'm the mother, I'm always there. But these house helps are also primary caregivers because they're very closely connected to these children. So the children form that emotional bond or attachment. So with several the more you detach, you receive, you detach, you receive, you detach. That child comes later on at 30, is not married, not able to sustain a relation. You're like, why are you not married at 50 or 60? You don't understand that problem started because of those experiences in the first 5 years of life. So you see how a parent could have caused the problem, but at 35 now they are giving the person hell because the person has not brought his spouse to the house. So these are some. So we have a call coming in. Okay. Good morning. This is Legit Therapy Show. What's your name and where are you calling from?
My name is Marcus, calling from Surulere.
Marcus, how are you today?
I'm fine, I'm doing fine. I just wanted to ask, is there a treatment for this childhood trauma? Is there a treatment for it? Can it be treated?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marcus. We'll get there. We'll get there later in the show. Thank you. Keep listening. Okay, so I've talked about all the different kinds of scenarios that can lead to trauma. We talked about something as that we think is very benign, frequent rotation or changing of our house helps. That can also have a long-lasting implication on our children. And with this frequent, with these exposures, with this trauma, children find it difficult to learn to trust other people. So it has a big implication on their ability to trust. Children start to grow up with trust issues, because of the impact of trauma on their early lives. Children also can grow up with difficulty regulating their emotions, anger outbursts, extreme sadness, so difficulty controlling emotions. When the anger is there, it's extreme. They're breaking things, they're destroying things in rages of anger, they're slapping policemen, in rages of things like that, and then when they're sad, they're extremely sad, it's very low. So they can have difficulty regulating emotions. Then the way the individual interacts with the world as the child grows up, you might find it difficult to really trust people, to bond in terms of relationships, in terms of attachments. Attachments might be insecure, they might not be as secure as they should be. So relationship issues, difficulty getting into relationship, maintaining relationships, both sexy, be it with the opposite sex or even with the same sex, we can see that. So there's a faulty sense of safety, and stability in the world as the individual progresses. Good morning, this is a Legit Therapy Show. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Please, can you speak up?
Good morning.
Thank you.
I'm Young Shiner calling from Abuja.
Good morning, Young Shiner.
Okay. How are you doing, Doctor?
Fine, thank you. Fine, thank you.
Okay. I've been on your show for like 20 minutes now. I would like to I'm really enjoying the show. It's actually my first time.
Okay.
And I have a question to ask.
Okay.
Okay, how can you help maybe a victim who has been traumatized in childhood and in one way or the other started indulging in crack? How can we help such a person?
Okay. Thank you, Young Shiner. We'll get there. We'll get there as we progress in the show. Thank you so much. Yes.
All right, thanks.
So, trauma in childhood affects children's ability, or young adults or adults, children becoming adults, ability to trust other people, ability to regulate their emotions, the way they interact with the world, the way they ability to keep relationships and maintain relationships with same sex and even with the opposite sex, their sense of safety and stability in the world around them. Their self-worth as individuals also affected by those early childhood years. Imagine someone that has gone through emotional abuse. Of course, it would have a big and devastating effect on the individual's self-worth, and even impulsivity, the ability to make decisions, their ability to think through decisions and act are also affected by childhood trauma or childhood experiences. We say that when children go through these situations, they develop what we call schemas. So a child growing up in such a hostile environment or an unpredictable environment or unstable environment develops some set of schemas or some set of mindsets that goes in there and just sits somewhere at the back of their mind and remains there as the child goes on. So I'll give an example. You grow up in a household where you watch your mother being beaten every day, called all kinds of names and all that. Somehow a young girl can grow up with a schema at the back of her mind that maybe men cannot be trusted, or women are meant to be beaten, or just some mindset just develops somewhere at the back of the mind and sits down there. The person carries on through life, goes to school, works and achieves and does all kinds of things, and then comes up 20 years after trying to get into a relationship, or tries to starts to, you now start to see the manifestation in those relations, because when they get into relationships and something triggers that mindset or that schema, those thoughts come back immediately, and that's the default. That will be the person's default mindset in that situation. So they now get into a situation where they're dating someone, and then the person raises their hand once like this. That automatically just takes the person back to the frequent beatings they experienced as a child and they saw as a child, and it can create, start a ripple effect of emotions and thoughts and even behaviors, because it now triggers something that the person thought had gone away or had ceased to exist. But just raising that hand to that person in that moment brings back all those things, and then the person can start to act in certain ways or take certain decisions. And people now wonder in that moment, why is the person acting that way, not understanding that if you backtrack if you go back to childhood, that's where the root cause of the problem is. So we're just trying to get everyone to be aware or understand that a lot of the behaviors, a lot of the things we see in a lot of people in adulthood didn't just start in adulthood. The root cause has been from childhood. When you have a very secure, healthy, stable environment as a child, it automatically just plays out as you being a more stable, secure adult who's able to form healthier relationships, who's able to be more balanced as an individual. But when that childhood was rocky or unstable or unpredictable, of course, you will see the manifestation in adulthood. So let's always backtrack to childhood whenever we see certain behaviors that we don't understand in our friends, in our spouses, in our siblings. Let's backtrack to childhood experiences. Now I'll move on to the biological effects of ACE or childhood trauma. I talked about psychological effects, and the psychological effects, like I talked about, ability to trust and all that, and repressed emotions, and repressed angers, and faulty attachments and all that. But there's also the biological effects. So the biological effect has to do with the HPA axis, which is what we call the hypothalamo-pituitary axis. HPA axis is connected to our stress reactions, the way we react to stress as individuals. So once children are exposed to stressful situations, emotionally or physically stressful situations in childhood, what happens is that we prematurely activate their HPA stress response. Ideally, that stress response should be growing for such a time when they need it in later life, But children that experience neglect, so you have a newborn, for something as simple as a newborn whose diaper gets wet, who's hungry, who needs to be cuddled, and doesn't get that. So the child cries for hours and no one comes to cuddle the child, no one comes to change the diaper. That's where the problem starts, Then that child going on into toddlerhood or early childhood, and there's some form of neglect or some form of abuse, what happens is that those experiences are very stressful for the individual or for the child, and it just activates the HPA as a way to respond to stress. So when the HPA gets activated, the resultant hormone, or what we get at the end of the line, is adrenaline on the short term. You get the adrenaline, your body releases adrenaline for you to be able to handle that situation, and then we get our trauma responses like we talked about last week. The 4 F's of trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So your body, once HPA is activated, because the body perceives a stressful reaction or a stressful experience, we release our stress hormones. In the short term, that is adrenaline, and in those moments it will serve the child in childhood, where the child becomes anxious. So that drunk father comes in, the child runs in under the table to hide, is anxious, he's crying under the table, he's anxious because he doesn't want to be beaten that night, or watching the mother being beaten and is crying, and all those things. So those things just activate stress responses in the child, and they're coming on too early, because if it's frequent, it's coming on too early. And we know that with stress responses in the acute phase, we release adrenaline, but once stress becomes prolonged, it progresses from adrenaline to cortisol. So the body now starts to produce cortisol, and the longer the stress the stressor drags, the more cortisol you're releasing, and the more cortisol you're flooding into the system, the more you're making the body susceptible to stress related illnesses, the more vulnerable the immune system becomes to, be it physical health conditions, be it mental health conditions. So it's not surprising to find individuals with ACE coming down with diabetes in adulthood, hypertension, ulcers, stress related ulcers, even cancers have been linked to ACEs as well, depression, anxiety, so many illnesses. People that fall ill all the time, they always feel like there are any illness flying around. The immunity doesn't seem strong enough to catch whatever might be flying around. So you just find there's a long list of stress related illnesses, autoimmune illnesses, and all kinds of things. So you find that all this ACE in childhood now plays out as certain disorders in adulthood, and people are like, I don't even understand why I'm coming down with this. But several researches have been done, and it's been proven, and it's been shown that ACEs are related to chronic illnesses in adulthood. So this is something that we should be mindful of and be ready to understand, because imagine that parent now that put that child through all that in childhood now has to now be that same parent that has to take that child to the hospital over and over again in their 40s and 50s because of a problem that they probably caused in that person's childhood. So these are things that we need to put into consideration. Now, moving on to the next phase of the show, we'll be talking about coping strategies, and this is where I'm going to get my guest involved, Mrs. Abimbola Adebakin, who is the CEO of Advantage Health Africa, and also the owner of a franchise called OutRRAage, which creates rage rooms and smash rooms across the world globally. It's a global franchise, and we have it here in Lagos in Ikate, Lekki. So now when people go through these situations, when individuals go through situations, most times people don't remain dormant or docile through such trauma or crisis. They put in certain coping skills. That's why they were able to survive to adulthood. If they did not cope in one way or the other, they wouldn't have made it to adulthood. People that didn't cope died in that trauma or in the neglect or in childhood. But those that made it through to adulthood found a way to cope, found a coping style that now worked for them, and they just carried that on into adulthood. But coping styles vary. There are different coping styles, and they vary, and we would describe coping styles as behavioral and cognitive techniques used to, 1, reduce unpleasant emotions, 2, to deal with difficult situations, to solve problems, to intervene in periods of crisis, and to manage stress. So as individuals, every one of us has our own coping style that comes into play when we need to solve problems, when we need to manage stress, when we need to face difficult situations. But coping styles differ. So we have the adaptive or the healthy ones, and we have the unhealthy ones. In terms of healthy ones, we have problem focused and emotion focused coping styles, which are healthier alternatives. So when some people would cope with religion, we have some others that when they face problems, they start to face their church more often. That's one of the very, very common ones we see. You say, mommy, I started going to church. All the midweek services. She started going for all the midweek services. There's probably a problem she's facing. She's trying to cope, and that is helping her with that problem. It's a coping style. By the time the problem gets resolved, church now becomes a Sunday affair. For some people, it might be positive reframing. So we have healthy ones like positive reframing, where in those situations you're trying to reframe your mindset. You're trying to adjust the way you see the situation and restructure your mindset to address the situation. Some people would use relaxation techniques, deep breathing exercises, physical exercises, hit the gym. They start to feel stressed, they hit the gym. Some people would tap into their social support. That might be the time they now start to call their friends more, start to hang out more with their friends, spending more time with other people. That's their own coping style. So different people, different coping styles. Those are the healthy ones. But for some people, they use humor. In those moments, you might wonder what is there to laugh about in this situation, but the person is trying to find humor in every situation. And an example would be when we talk about Nigeria and then we start to create memes. Something we hear about something that goes on, and before someone has gone and created a meme and everybody is watching and laughing online. That is a coping style. For some people it's distraction. For others, they vent. They come on the radio, they pick up their phone, they call the radio, and they vent and vent for hours. And because they know there's someone that will be ready to listen to them on the other end. So different people, different styles, but they're unhealthy styles as well, which brings us to our topic for today. Some people would cope with denial. They would deny that the problem exists. They would deny that whatever they're going through exists. And some would blame themselves for whatever it is they're going through, whatever challenges they've been going through. They would put that blame on themselves. And it's not unusual for us to now see some of these people go down with substance or alcohol addiction. For some people, they are having anger outbursts, so they are transferring aggression on other people. They take out this aggression on other people. We talked about how these children in such situations can have repressed emotions, repressed anger, and for some people, as a maladaptive way of coping, they transfer their aggression to other people. So those children go to school, they are bullying other children in school. Meanwhile, the source of the bully is because at home there's something going on that makes them very uncomfortable, and then their own way of acting it out is going to school and picking on another child, and hurting another child. For some people, it's on the road. They exhibit their rage on the road. They come out, something happens, and then they take it out on the next person on the road. They take it out on the next person on the road. It can be, anger can come out in different ways. Anger can come out as substance abuse. So the individual is angry about the situation, what has happened in their life, how things have played out, and then the anger turns inwards. So anger can turn inwards where you're so angry on the inside, and the only way to numb that anger you feel or the emotions you feel is by drinking it away or smoking it away. Some people become suicidal in those moments. Suicide is also anger turned inwards as well. You feel angry, you blame yourself for some of those things, and you might take it out on yourself as well. So those are some ways people manifest their trauma. But now we're also going to talk about other ways to manage this anger. Or we can't say that addiction is the only way or the best way. It's not even the best way to manage a lot of these emotions, because addiction at the end of the day takes charge. Initially starts, the alcohol helps to numb the pain on the short term, but as time progresses, you find that the alcohol becomes the master, or the marijuana or the drug of use becomes the master, and then it becomes a difficult habit to quit. We also, taking it out on other people is not the way, because you might hit someone and that might lead to the person's death, and then you're talking about court case and all that. That might not be another way. So that's why we've involved with Abimbola today, because she has come up with a fantastic innovation. She's brought on something new, something wonderful that we haven't really seen in Africa, but it exists in other parts of the world, and it can be very helpful for our mental health and even for therapy. It works as an adjunct for anger management and therapy. So there are people with repressed emotions, be it repressed sadness or repressed anger, emotions that are deep within, even repressed memories, emotions that are deep within that they have not been able to let out, maybe because of the kind of personalities they have, or because of the situations they find themselves. Maybe they feel they're helpless in whatever situations they find themselves, and they're not able to express how they truly feel. OutRRAage is an opportunity for us to express our repressed emotions. So bringing those emotions from the inside and letting it out in a safe and supportive environment. So instead of keeping anger in for 10 years, 15 years, carrying it on, before you know, the person is diagnosed with one cancer or the other, or one mental health condition or the other, and it becomes a different story. Miss Adebakin has, with her team, have come up with a fantastic innovation to help us express our anger. So I'm going to pass the mic to her now to share with us what OutRRAage is about and how they've been able to help people living in Lagos.
Thank you very much. I think you've really said a lot around why we have set up OutRRAage. So it's a global franchise that we have here, and our first expression is in Ikate, Lekki. But the goal really is to have at least one, OutRRAage center close to you. So if we can have one in each local government area, quite honestly, we think it will cater to the people there. Too many people are taking out their anger on others. So there's a lot of road rage, and a very famous one happened recently, and we might laugh, or we might be sad, or we might just gawk at it on social media, but a lot of that is happening. We've heard cases of people bring out a gun to shoot a rider just because they disturbed you on the road. Instead of doing that, come into a place that is built specifically for you to express that anger rather than repress it. Too many times, if you repress, it leads to internal stress, and it has consequences that Dr. Jibunoh has talked about. Diseases come out from it, headaches, all sorts of migraines, or we call stress of diseases of unknown origin. A lot of that is happening, and it's on the rise. So instead of doing yourself harm, take out a session. I know smashing is not for everybody, but you don't know until you try it. Some people might be better off screaming. We've got rooms you can scream there. Some people might be better off spraying and splashing. So you see in some places where they spray all sorts on the wall and all, come over and spray. The point is, do something rather than internalize this rage. Don't bash your wife, don't bash your husband, don't bash your kids. Come out here, spend time. If your children have gone to school and the house is alone, then come out here. Bring a picture of someone who disappointed you. Paste the picture on one of the items you're going to smash. Speak to the person, in that picture, in that room. You're alone. So you've got a whole room for you to shout at someone that you can't ordinarily shout at, especially a boss. You can't shout at a boss. Come out and do it at the Rage Room. Come to Lekki. You can book a session on outrrage.com. But OutRRAage is spelled OUTRRR, then AGE.
That's triple R.
Triple R, because it's a rage relief room.
Okay.
The concept is a rage relief room where you can express rage without harming yourself or harming someone else. And you can even bring some items. Some people had an item given to them by someone who deceived and cheated them, and they don't want it again. Bring it and smash it, and deliver yourself, so to speak, from that angle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And on this note, we would wrap up the show with a brief reminder that a lot of behaviors we see in adults didn't just originate in adulthood. Most times they take their roots in childhood. People grow up in diverse homes. We experience all kinds of childhood experiences. It can be one intense, life-threatening, life-changing experience, or it can be a series of smaller intensity experiences that now come together to have a long-term impact on the person's psychological and physical health. So it's important that when we feel like we have this repressed anger that comes out as outbursts every now and then, and it seems out of proportion to whatever the issue was. So our outburst goes beyond whatever it is that triggers the anger. Maybe it's time to think about visiting the OutRRAage room or speaking with the therapist about whatever it is that is bottled up in there. So on this note, we would wrap up the show. We thank the Freudian Center Lagos for supporting us again. This show has been brought to you and sponsored and powered by the Freudian Center. We thank them again for their support, and the Freudian Center can be reached on 0809 60075. 0809 60075, and the website is www.freudiancenter.com. Center is CENTRE. You can also shoot us an email on info@freudiancenter.com. As from next week, the show will move to 11 a.m. So we would be here again 11 a.m. next week on the Legit Therapy Show. Thank you very much.
The Legit